record. Okay, Bismillah, we're here with Stephen Beyer. I sent a copy of the translation of Henry Corbin's On Islam Iranien, translated as Inside Iranian Islam, done by, I believe, a Dutch Polish translator back in the zeros. And this thing was uploaded initially online. I've read the French, but this thing was circulating then, and you know, people have asked for it. It used to be online. A lot of people had access to it, then it went offline. We don't know who or where the translator currently is, but apparently they make this available to the public. And so, you know, Steve has been working in this area, you know, Grail legends and that sort of thing. And I thought it would be a good idea for him to read what Henry Corbin has to say about the matter. So, Steve, take it away. What did you think of this book, the second volume of Inside Iranian Islam, On Islam Iranien?
Henry Corbin is really incredible, and I wish I had this earlier when I had started my study, linking Grail legendary and Iran and Zoroaster, which I had started. And I had found a lot of interesting stuff that led me in directions, but there was so much bad scholarship available in English at the time that this one's been really eye-opening and is very helpful. The things that it opens up. So starting, I think, with Zoroastrianism and its view of the kings in the ancient cycle as sages, and tying that into the history of the leaders of the House of the Prophet. Seems to show like that there's a continuity of guidance, of right guidance, and some of the things that I was thinking of with how the Zoroastrians had the ritual of the Hyoma, and how their perception of these things, it seems really advanced for the ancient world, but I suppose that's my own perspective being problematic, because often in the modern world, we're not as advanced. We're actually backward. We just imagine ourselves to be.
That's true. It's very true. That's one of the fallacies about progress that neo-traditionalists are very good at, you know, critiquing quite often. That time is not so much time, but at least the consciousness of humanity in what they perceive as the Kali Yuga is actually falling from what it was. So, you know, time is actually moving backwards rather than forwards. I don't necessarily agree with that perspective for a very simple metaphysical reason, in that that, you know, if we talk about, when we talk about the Godhead, right, and especially in Islamic metaphysics, time, first of all, is God. There's a hadith to that effect, you know, do not inveigh against time, for verily God is time. But also, there are two aspects of God's eternality. There is the pre-eternal element of time attributed to the Godhead. Then there is the post-eternal element that is attributed to the Godhead. One is, you know, pre-eternity is as far back in time as one can possibly go. And then post-eternity is as far forward as one can go into time. And this dichotomy is actually one of the very important ones that rests within the metaphysics of the Bab. So I don't accept this cyclical notion that comes especially from India, that neo-traditionalists are very big on, where, you know, the Kali Yuga is the age of decay, and you know, the golden age of the Kali Yuga was somewhere around, you know, about 60,000 years ago. But, you know, this particular time that we are living in, it does appear to be quite a very strange time. And, you know, Henry Corbin's scholarship to that effect on Zoroastrian and all of Henry Corbin's scholarship about this stuff kind of echoes this, that at least in the modern period, at least during the last 300 to 500 years, there has been a kind of a dumbing down of the consciousness of humanity. The neo-traditionalists and Rene Guénon especially, kind of describes this as the reign of quantity, that there's been a progressive quantification of the mentality of humanity because of this whole idea of the Kali Yuga. But Henry Corbin doesn't, completely subscribe to this idea for a very simple reason, is that, even though contemporary humanity might be a little bit dense on, genuinely initiatic matters, much of this kind of stuff that Henry Corbin himself is talking about is happening at a time beyond the mundane. What Mircea Eliade defined as in illo tempore, and in this in illo tempore time, these events are happening. So in the world of the Alem Mythal, the world of the Mundus imaginalis, the world of the active imagination, which is this kind of an isthmus Balzaci realm, from which a lot of these narratives or visionary recitals is the way that Corbin phrases it. All of these are happening right now. They may have happened in a time, but this time has its own proverbial horizon. So it is happening in a sense right at this time, although from a chronological point of view, it could also be happening in a very distant past. So one has to really understand this very subtle phenomenology of Henry Corbin's, so that one doesn't, and this is where I make the distinction between Corbin and the neo-traditionalists, is that because the neo-traditionalists are very, arbitrary on this particular point, in my opinion. And that is because they subscribe to this whole Manvantara system of cyclical times that comes from India. Whereas with Henry Corbin, it's a lot more subtle. And also, whether we're talking about the Zoroastrian tradition or even the Abrahamic tradition, time has a culmination to which everything is moving, which at least in the Zoroastrian tradition is the coming of the Frashkerti with the emergence of the Seyoshat, the Zoroastrian Messiah. You find the same idea in all three of the Abrahamic traditions, that even though there is a fall, from a certain consciousness that may have existed a couple thousand years ago, nevertheless, time is actually moving towards its ultimate synthesis in the coming of the Messiah, or the second coming, or the apokatastasis, Armageddon, as it were, when we take it from the esoteric point of view, etc.
Now,
go ahead. Go.
From the Bayanic point of view, so there's like a renewal of divine revelations.
Yes.
And in a way, it's like the seasons that come. And so for me, because I've discovered the primal point and the Bab, my study of Corbin's text is interesting, because when he talks about the mystical pole, and the idea that there's going to be individuals that will be there and sort of bring in the new season.
Yes.
And I think that in some ways with the new neo-traditionalists they sort of have just humanity stuck in a cycle of
decay. Yeah.
And I think this is actually appealing to fascism.
Oh, yeah.
Because the idea that society is falling apart and therefore I need a beer hall coup or to storm the Capitol or something like that like the fascist impulse likes the one part of the story without the other part.
Yeah, that's a very good observation, because that is exactly the case. This is why you've had such a stampede of these far rightists in the last decade or so into reading Guénon, but more so Evola than even Guénon. Whereas Corbin kind of straddles a line that is very much more subtle than the neo-traditionalists, in that respect. So, Henry Corbin is not amenable to being that easily appropriated by the far right and fascists, although Alexander Dugin has tried it many times simply because of, because of Corbin's ideas, and also because Corbin was the first Frenchman who actually translated Heidegger, who is Dugin's hero. But yeah, Corbin is in a kind of nomad, kind of where he wants to be, in a nowheresville between all of these various esoteric camps. So he's in his own place. I mean, there are various things of Corbin's that I disagree with, that are quite problematic in from certain points of view, especially from the point of view of theodicy. But overall, I think Corbin is a much more palatable and a much better figure to read and contemplate than figures like Guénon and Evola, Commerçois, etc. Especially and particularly on this notion of time, because when you read Corbin, whether you're reading Spiritual Body and Celestial Earth, or this volume of Un Islam Iranien, or any of his other stuff, he is talking to an individual and trying to initiate through the text an individual and orient them. He's doing what Zoroastrian did in his visionary recitals. This is something that a lot of people who have really studied Henry Corbin and dealt with these texts for a very long time have realized that what Corbin is offering in his prose, and especially in the original French, is kind of a intellectualized iteration of a visionary narrative of the kind that Zoroastrian or Avicenna offers, right? So it is situating someone. When you sit down and read Spiritual Body and Celestial Earth, you're not just reading a text about, describing the ideas of a spiritual tradition, but if you're reading him carefully, he is actually taking you into that world, So it's both has this, it's obviously nonfiction, but it also has simultaneously this meta-narratival kind of mythopoeic element. I hesitate to use the word fiction because that's not what Corbin is doing, but he draws you in, right? So this is the good thing about Corbin, because he's speaking to the individual. He's not speaking to a collective. Whereas the Guénonians and all of the neo-traditionalists oftentimes are not speaking to an individual at all. And with Guénon, he over-intellectualizes the metaphysics to such an extent that the individual is not even present anymore, right? And with Corbin, someone just mentioned this recently, this Charles Stern, in his lecture that he did, that I posted on my Facebook wall. Corbin, obviously, of course, he has an interest on the nature of the Godhead and the nature of the great mystery, etc. But the primary concern of Corbin's writing is about these ideas amongst fleshy human beings who are living in the crypt, as it were. Now, this has if you have read Zoroastrian, especially the Tale of the Occidental Exile, you realize where Corbin is getting this. On one level, you can make the argument that he's getting this from Heidegger's notion of the Dasein, being there, which is very worldly and atemporal, right? But on the other hand, he's also getting it from the Qissa Qurbat al-Qarbiya, because in this narrative, right, the hero, the main character of the story, makes it out of the cosmic crypt, as it were, and approaches and actually attains and enters the world of light. But once he gets there, he's told he has to go back, and that's when the story ends. And this is the point at which I believe that Corbin has written a lot of the stuff that he writes about. It's at the point where the voyager who has actually seen the world of light has to go back and now make sense of the fleshy material world that they're in, to strive to then begin to see this world, this materialized world, with what Corbin calls the eyes of fire.
Well, if one takes it in a Platonic metaphor, there's a certain danger to having such eyes, because the people who are still chained up will want to fight to defend their chains. Which
incidentally has been happening to Corbin since 1978 in the academy, because his peers in many of these departments don't like him. They don't know what to make of Corbin. Is he a believer? Is he not a believer? If he's a believer, he has no business, in their opinion, about writing about these subjects. So they nitpick at him and have criticized him and even slandered and defamed him in print. And people like John Walworth don't even mention his name and when dealing with subjects that Corbin dealt with 40, 50 years before they did, and so on and so forth. But nevertheless, Corbin, in my opinion, and I've read everything he's ever written, and what Corbin is doing is a philosophical project. He is accurately portraying these figures, and particularly Zoroastrian, very accurately. He's not deviating from the basic ideas and the core ideas of these figures. But what you have to realize is that Corbin, because of his philosophical project, is also a narrator in his own right? So you have to see it from you have to see these people through Corbin's eyes, in a sense. That doesn't mean that Corbin has disfigured a figure like Zoroastrian, which is an accusation that sometimes certain people have leveled at Corbin. I don't see that. And I've not only read all of Corbin, but I've also read all of the texts of the philosophical figures and authors that he's dealt with. And so I see what Corbin sees, for example, in a text like this, like the Hikmat al-Ishraq, or in a text like the Tale of the Occidental Exile that I mentioned before. And even with Mullah Sadra and Sheikh Ahmed Ahsai and some of these other figures that he's dealt with in the past. And I think it's very unfair to level certain things that Corbin, that the Academy has been doing. But yeah, by the same token, we can also say that there are certain, blind spots to Corbin. And one of the blind spots that Corbin has, and he gets this to some degree actually from the Sheikhi school, from the Kermanis, who are distant relations through my father, where, although they never actually quite come and say it in the way that Corbin puts it, nevertheless, it's kind of implied that you never actually have the Parousia of the Imam actually happen. The Christ never actually returns to the material world. That, the second coming is a individual event that happens in the horizons of the world of the imagination. I profoundly disagree with that. And for number of reasons. Number one, from from point of view of theodicy, but also the way that the Bayan, kind of phrases this in overall problem is a very good one, because on the one hand, it agrees with Corbin that there is no end to material history, right? But on the other hand, it disagrees with Corbin in that, because there isn't an end to material history, that doesn't mean that the actual resurrection or the Qiyamah doesn't occur. It does occur. So Corbin, for example, has wonderful gushing things to say about the Ismailis, and especially the Ismailis of Alamut, who in 1176, under their Imam, Hassan II, ala dhikrihi salam, proclaimed the resurrection, right? But then swiftly after this proclamation was made, there was massive dissent, and eventually Hassan II found himself murdered. But if Corbin can recognize that event, as it were, then I think some of the commentary that he puts about, in an implied way about the Babis is actually quite misplaced, because he's kind of missing the forest for it, because these two events in many ways are almost identical, and in many ways the Bab actually even went beyond what the Ismailis of Alamut were speculating about the nature of the Qiyamah, because what the Bab then posits is endless Qiyamat, endless continual resurrections, endless comings of endless Parousias of the Godhead through the talismanic human temple, which is an extremely beautiful idea. It resonates, number one, with the ideas of the transubstantial motion that we find in someone like Mullah Sadra, and also in a much more sophisticated way. This whole idea also happens with Sheikh Ahmed As-Sahi. But Corbin had a problem with this, that this event can actually occur, that the God-man can actually step into the plane of history, even though he did recognize it in terms of Islam with the Ismailis, and obviously, the careers of the Imams themselves and the Prophet of Islam. So that is probably my criticism of Corbin on that issue, where the end of the world is kind of psychologized, rather than made into a real event with a real horizon, as the Bayan proclaims, where
something that's going to keep on happening
yeah,
over and over
and over and over, because the mystery is so vast and so deep and so both, unattainable, but at the same time, the overflowing of the Godhead. Just this is an idea that you find in Plotinus, where the Godhead, the one Tohen, cannot help itself in its superabundant flowing out of itself to create creation. This is the same principle that the Bab subscribes to, that even though you have a transcendent Godhead that is unapproachable and that gnosis of it is impossible, nevertheless, this Godhead is continually unveiling itself through the primal will, and periodically within the various stages of history of humanity.
So from the stages of humanity, so from Zoroaster and the ancient legendary king Kursaw all the way.
Khosrow, yeah.
I never knew how to pronounce that correctly. Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
So in the cycle of the kings of Iran, the idea of these is sort of a transition from polytheism to monotheism, but not like that there were different gods, but that there was a new understanding that was coming to the people. And so in Corbin's writing, he talks about sort of how there's this Zoroastrianism is often dismissed as dualism,
which it actually isn't. It's not dualist in the sense that you find dualism in Manichaeanism, where you have the forces of light and darkness being equal. That doesn't exist in Zoroastrianism. Zoroastrianism is monotheistic in the sense that the powers of the celestial world, number one, are the creators, right? But number two, in a sense, they're not in all sense. The Angramanu, the chaos or the drudge, is not equal, even though in this world of mixture within the material world, we find the dominance in certain areas of these counter powers of darkness. Nevertheless, from the point of the celestial world, from the point of view of the Ahura Mazda and his 6 archangels, the Amasra Spentai, the Ahriman is already always subdued in a sense, if you know what I mean. So the Angramanu can never actually break through, this particular world, and assault, as it were, Ahura Mazda. It can assault the angelic hypostasis or the angelic theurgies within this world itself, as what Zoroastrian eschatology talks about. That they suddenly, there's a rupture in the world of the drudge, the world of the counter powers, and they flow into this world and they start assaulting the angel of the world. And then that's when the knights of Ormaz, the knights of the archangel of the earth, arise, and out of whom then emerges their leader, which was the Seoshat, who was the return of Zarathustra. So but they never actually can manage to actually assault the Godhead itself, because the Godhead is even beyond that. So this is something that Corbin several times kind of underscores in several of his writings about Zoroastrianism, that in a sense the Ahriman or the drudge or the Angramanu is already always subdued by the powers of the celestial world.
I suspect there was some Western ethnocentrism or cultural supremacy for the marginalization of Zoroastrianism, because they wanted to make Judeo-Christianity like unique and first, and something next to it that was very troubling to them, I think. So often in English sources, Zoroastrianism, it seems to be handled in a way that's to minimize a lot of its importance.
Well, this is because this is something I would call the what's the term? Someone used it in the context of one of these major figures of Islam. It's the anxiety of influence. Because we know for a fact that Zoroastrianism is one of the master narrators of the Abrahamic tradition as a whole, all three of them. I mean, even within the Quran, there's explicit, Zarathustrian motifs and Zarathustrian imagery. Like, for example, the light verse of the Quran is a classic example of this. And even the sort of dualism that you find in the Quran, in the moral dualism in the world of man, this is the Avestan message. This is straight out of a Zarathustra's Avesta, right? It's the same kind of monotheism. But because of that, and because, throughout the ancient period, Zoroastrianism really sometimes directly influenced, whether we're talking about the Greeks, and, you have references, for example, in the dialogues of Plato on a constant basis, sometimes in certain dialogues about the Iranians and Zarathustra. And then during that, syncretic period of high antiquity, where, Zarathustra and Zoroastrian becomes a very important, master narrative to a lot of these Gnosticisms. And then moving into Christianity itself, where the whole idea of heaven and hell that then later on Judaism itself takes on board. This whole idea of heaven and hell and the Messiah, the whole messianic idea has an Iranian origin. It didn't exist in Judaism. The whole idea of the Mashiach in Judaism is a much later development. I mean, contrary to what certain people would have you believe. So this obviously comes from Iran. And then we have the same thing happening in Islam. So, the shadow of Zoroastrianism hangs very long over all three of these Abrahamic traditions. I don't necessarily look at this as a bad thing, as a believer myself. I look at this as a very salutary and very important thing, because the Avesta or the Mazda Yasna, as the Zoroastrians call it, the good religion, has a lot to say and has a lot to dialogue with these Abrahamic creeds. And it did. And when it did, it enriched these Abrahamic traditions. And a lot of the ontology and the soteriology of all three of these Abrahamic traditions comes from that Zoroastrian matrix. And this is a very wonderful thing. Now, yes, scholars, whether we're talking about Orientalists or even contemporary people of, in the comparative religion field, have certain points of departure about Zoroastrianism, try to sometimes minimize the influence of Zoroastrianism over the West. But the fact of the matter is that, throughout the ancient world and throughout a lot of the ancient texts, whether we're talking about Greek or Latin, there is a constant presence of Zoroastrianism. They mention it, these figures, whether we're talking about Plato or then some of the Platonists, or even when we move into Plotinus himself. Now, the question that scholars are trying to answer at the moment, which in my opinion, they're not really succeeding, is that they want to know what was the original Zoroastrianism, or what was the Zoroastrianism that played such an important role, for example, in the late Ecumenic period. What was the Zoroastrianism that would have interacted with say the Plutarchs and the Herodotuses, etc., when Alexander came. This is an unknown, primarily because a lot of these texts, these early Zoroastrian texts, were destroyed. And this wasn't just one particular incident. This happened on the one hand in the late Ecumenic period with the coming of Alexander the Great. Certain texts were lost. Then they were reconstructed. Then this happened again during the fall of the Parthian Empire and the becoming of the Sassanids. Then there is, the whole thing about the Sassanids themselves. The Sassanids were not exactly orthodox for Zoroastrianism. The consensus appears to be that the Sassanians were actually Zurvanists, which is an extremely interesting Zoroastrian heresy, because this basically posits a god that is even beyond Ahura Mazda and Ahriman, and who is actually the creator of both. And Zurvanism, that Zurvanist narrative, actually is one of the conspicuous narratives that you find constantly in Shia hadith, beginning with Khomeini's book of the Higher Intelligence and the Acosmic Ignorance. So, and Corbin was obviously very much switched on to all of this stuff. Yeah, go ahead.
One of the things that whenever I think of Zurvan Zivranism.
Mm.
One of the things that I always think about is how Subi Azal's brother and him were such opposites in their spiritual legacies, and sort of something about the two twins in sort of a conflict that will echo down the ages just sort of seems to remind me of that. I apologize, but for some reason, whenever I think of that, it brings me to the conflict that we sometimes see in religion. And so often when there is a true spiritual source, there's a usurper who tries to use it for power and for the wrong way. So that frequently there's a small group of believers and a large group of people who superficially believe but are led astray.
Mm. But this seems to be a constant throughout, especially the Abrahamic traditions. You find this narrative also in the Old Testament. And yeah, this is one of the curses, I would say, of the whole Abrahamic tradition as a whole, that this particular narrative seems to reoccur again and again and again and again in different forms. I guess in one level, maybe that whenever it does happen, that this may be a testimony to the veracity of that particular tradition. But yeah, this is exactly the story of Sopa Azal and his brother. Yeah, that very much is the case. Yeah.
Back to so with Corbin's take on Hermetica and Mithrica, the Holy Grail, I feel like I have plenty of stuff to lecture, but to a very small audience of people. Like, it takes a large amount of knowledge to get into these things.
Yeah.
I actually am trying to figure out how to break some of this down into memes, because I've seen so many bad memes that spread so much false information that I'm trying to figure out, like, some quotes of Corbin would definitely be memeable and spreadable. And
they would be, but when you do that, try to get the heart of what he's saying. Corbin is good, yeah, he is memeable, to a relatively educated audience, and some people occasionally, I mean, on Facebook you see this a lot, little snippets of quotes by Henry Corbin appearing here and there. But when he is meme, one has to be careful not to lose the message and the kind of threads that he's building through with a lot of these arguments, because this is what Corbin is doing throughout all of his various works. Every book of his has a center, but within the center there are threads or tenuities. The raqiqa of, like, you find in Ibn Arabi's work, and so you have to, every single one of these threads is connected in a sense to the center. So it's like the sun and its rays. And this is a very Ishraqi kind of approach that Corbin had. That is his phenomenology. So one has to be careful not to try to reduce Corbin to one or two quotes. But yeah, I mean, it occasionally, something sticks out, whether it's a paragraph or a sentence or something. Yeah, one should use it and deploy it in the right place. Sure.
I feel like a large number of Western esoterics terrorists would love this book, and that there's a lot of people who have interest in this, but because there's so much garbage in the New Age market, that they're not going to be able to find a gem like. Not
just the New Age market, even in the academic scholarship, you have a lot of nonsense. I mean, what Corbin does in this particular volume of his in Islam Iranien, for example, regarding the issue of the Grail, right, which is such a central motif to European esotericism, and you barely ever in contemporary academic print with even people like Wouter Hanegraaff, who's generally a good scholar, but he's got his biases galore. The stuff that Corbin is doing in this particular volume are amazing, because he basically locates the origins of the Grail legends in Iran, and particularly with those narratives that eventually made up the Shahnameh. So, the cup of Jamshid or Khosrow, these mythic kings of ancient Iran that played such a prominent place in Iranian literature, and are also the backdrop. They're kind of the proto figures of several of the characters of Ferdowsi's Shahnameh. Corbin locates the whole phenomenon, the phenomenological origin of the Grail with the mythos of Iran itself. And it makes absolute sense when you read that text, that is exactly the case, because much of this Grail legend doesn't exist in European literature until the Crusades happen. And it's only as a result of the Crusades that then we begin to see these ideas, coming out of the Middle East and into Europe, and then formulating themselves in their European context. But the Grail itself, it's such a rich symbolism, and then for what Corbin does in that book, by locating it in Iran and then unpacking the whole phenomenology of what that means through Sohrawardi, and then through the various influences around Sohrawardi himself, is just absolutely spectacular. This book should have, it did make a lot of waves in the early 1970s when it was first published. People like Harold Bloom, whose politics I don't like, but he was a great literary figure, just devoured these volumes of Corbin. And to such an extent that once the second English edition of Corbin's Creative Imagination in the Sufism of Ibn Arabi, that was retitled as Alone to the Alone, came out in the 90s, he wrote the introduction to it, but Corbin moved him, because the stuff that Corbin was talking about was just utterly, breathtaking. But the Academy doesn't like it, and the New Age cannot really make a buck out of the sort of ideas that Corbin is peddling in a book like that.
Well, there's a lot of misinformation and his straight talking, and I love his bibliography. I'm going to have to definitely look into, try to track down some of the sources. One of the things I was thinking of is how it relates to Freemasonry and concepts of knighthood and the Holy Grail that we have in some of the esoteric background in the West.
I would say everything. Whether one traces the emergence of Freemasonry in with the Knights Templar, or if it's an older genealogy, the fact of the matter is that within the Iranian Islamic landscape, and particularly in the Shiite version, there's a notion of chivalry that's quite old, that goes back even into the ancient period. In Iran, it's denoted as Javan Mardi. In Arabic, it's Futuwa. And Futuwa in Shiism, the embodiment of Futuwa is always Ali, alayhi salam, the first Imam. But this trope has a much older origin, because you find evidences of it within the Zoroastrian Iranian landscape as well. But it's very much developed, whether amongst the Shiites or the Sufis. There's a lot of books on Futuwa and Javan Mardi and what a Fatih is. So, if people are trying to delve into that particular aspect of it, of knighthood and chivalry, etc., then, this tradition has a lot to say about that.
Yeah, I would definitely, I want every Knight of the Red Cross to definitely read Chapter 4. And there's a tradition in Freemasonic knighthoods that the knighthood came from Iran. So it's like when I think of that degree and the story it tells, and also some of the writings that we have very much point to this sort of connection and this answer that we have in Corbin. And I've been, I guess, since about 2004 when I first read the Cycle of the Kings, and was starting to study this more in depth. Well, this is definitely, I wish I had this translation then, as opposed to some nonsense. I actually had to read a couple of chapters of, because I had some interest in plant sacraments and how that would tie into comparative religion in the Near East. So I picked up what I consider to be the worst book ever written, which was Allegro's The Mushroom and the Cross.
Oh,
and his
God.
treatment and butchery of things
Oh,
compared to unfortunately, that's sort of what we're up against when it comes to what people are looking for when they're studying things. They get, I don't know, he's quite quoted, and if you start doing research into plant sacraments online, you're more likely to get into quotes from him than you are to get quotes from Corbin. And at least when the study of Heoma and how that influenced the prophetic tradition of Iran's history. I would think that Allegro and all of his work should be avoided.
absolutely. And I would also, there are a couple of contemporary scholars that are good, and then there's a couple of them that are bad. One thing that I avoid, and I actually had to block someone recently who was actually quite eminent, because they're reducing they're being reductionistic in their identifying of the Heoma plant. And the thing is that when one reads, whether the original text or when one goes to the commentaries, or especially when one deals with someone like Henry Corbin and his ideas about what Heoma constitutes, to be reductionistic is to not get it, right? So if you want to say, this is the plant that is the Heoma, and this particular person was claiming that it is the cannabis. And I've read enough of this stuff, and also I've interacted long enough with Zoroastrians and also Sufis to know that that is impossible, that you can so nonchalantly try to identify this plant as just this.
That sounds like wishful thinking, that he came in wanting it to be that.
Yeah.
Or something.
Yeah.
Like, he didn't actually study what never mind.
But see but you get this a lot. I mean, this is why I think, even though it has its own handicaps, the work of Flattery of Schwartz is generally a good book. There are a lot of areas of that book, especially in the part where they're dealing with the actual, pharmacology, that, in my opinion, is slightly off. But where they deal with an analysis of the text, they are absolutely spot on, especially the Zoroastrian text. And I've shown this text to certain Zoroastrian mobads, Flattery and Schwartz, and they were actually surprised about how close these two scholars actually got. I mean, they didn't completely get there, but they were, let's say, 2/3 of the way there to getting it, about what the Heoma actually is. But this particular person doesn't have much of an opinion about Flattery and Schwartz in their book. They have their own pet peeve and theory about cannabis as the identity of the Soma and the Heoma, and just reducing everything to that. And I just, I don't. That's not how I roll about this.
That sounds like the essence of capitalism infecting spirituality,
which you actually find quite a lot in this whole crowd of entheogenicists. The Burning Man people and all of them. Yeah.
You get someone who's at the consumer level and not at the I mean, I'm not saying that there hasn't been spiritual use of cannabis in various cultures in history,
and there still is, like the sadhus of India, they use it, but this is not this is not the Soma.
It just does it, but it's just mislabeling the plant and doing very weak scholarship to try and make that comparison, in my opinion.
Yeah, it's not the Soma. And see, this is the thing. There are certain there's certain texts, Sanskrit texts that deal with the Soma. These were written maybe in the last 300, 400 years. And sometimes these authors make pronouncements that I have actually experienced, in that where they say that every plant is potentially the soma and can be the soma. Now, when I've read this stuff, I have actually experienced what that means, which is a completely different discussion. But to try to, and this is, I think, this is why there is such a debate, and there is such a, because I don't think any of these people who are writing about this have any idea, because they're not initiates or not proper initiates. Because they're, and this is why I think Corbin is so incredibly important to even approaching this question in the right way, is because he situates it at the right plane of experience. He gives you glimpses at the horizon in which this question of the soma or the heoma needs to be addressed. And if you don't have access to that realm, then in my humble opinion, you shouldn't be talking about this subject at all. Because this is after all, this entire thing is an initiatic craft. That's why in the ancient world there were high priests to the soma and the heoma and Niran. Are you there?
Yes.
Yeah.
I was just pondering what that was. The priesthood of Iran. Now, they're often called the Magi in the West.
Yeah.
It's one of those things where Western writers sometimes feel like if something's far enough in the past and from a far enough culture, they can write any imaginative thing about it they want. And I sometimes run into that when I start reading about the Magi, because I don't know, there is a lot of nonsense.
Oh yeah.
One of the things that seems very key to Corbin is the recital of visionary experiences.
Yes.
Would the Magi have been involved in things like this, do you think?
Well, there are certain Zoroastrian texts that you can certainly kind of recraft as being visionary narratives. And some of these hymns in particular.
So at least some interest, if not as much as Corbin's focus.
Well, because the actual genre that Corbin was dealing with has its precise pedigree in the writings of Zoroastrian and to some degree Avicenna. But you can also make the valid argument, and I think Corbin would not dismiss it, that certain of these ancient Zoroastrian hymns, especially even something like the hymn to Heoma, which are these long texts, can be taken in that from that perspective of being a visionary narrative, a recital, in the way that Corbin defined that word, as a symbolic allegory, as it were. A narrative that situates somebody, right? It's a situating narrative. It's not just a story. It's not just the text of litanies to be read. It actually situates the subject into the world or the horizon it is it is determined to take the subject to. And that's what, for example, texts such as the recital of the bird, which is usually attributed in its origins to Avicenna, but the way that Zoroastrian dealt with it in this Persian translation, he actually really spiced it up, and brought some of his own insight into his Persian translation, or his, the Crimson Archangel, Aklesork, or the creme de la creme of all of these visionary narratives, which is his Tale of the Occidental Exile, which is just absolutely amazing. I mean, I have been contemplating this thing for decades now. So yeah, that's what I'm saying is that with the Corbinian text, when you're reading Corbin, Corbin is doing from an intellectual format what Sohrawardi in those visionary narratives is doing from a narratival format, right? And once one clicks to that, then what Corbin is doing and what he's up to becomes a lot more sensible and tangible. It doesn't mean that one has, in a sense, completely fathomed it, but because these things are not meant to be fathomed in a one-time only kind of thing. They're meant to be contemplated over a lifetime. But that is what Corbin is actually doing throughout all of his texts. I mean, in my opinion, Corbin is truly the greatest 20th century esotericist. I mean, people usually claim the neo-traditionalists or Rene Guénon or Julius Evola, and they fit them into that role. I beg to differ. I don't see either one of those two figures in that role at all. I think Corbin was far deeper. Like I said, obviously the man had his blind spots, and there are several. One of which I put my finger on before, but he was truly the greatest esotericist of the 20th century, even beyond Jung, because with Jung, Jung has a sort of tension and anxiety to him because on the one hand, he loves these ideas from the esoteric traditions of Europe or the Gnosticism, the alchemy. He loves it, but Jung is always trying to hold himself back from being converted to these things. So what you end up with Jung is, you have a great exposition of these ideas, but yet they're psychologized. So they don't have any tangible reality beyond, as projections of the mind. Whereas Corbin was a complete convert to these ideas. So with Corbin, these ideas break into the realm of ontology. They have a being. There's a real sign, and da side to it. It's a real horizon, not in any Heideggerian sense, but in a truly Platonic sense. And that is, I would say, the difference between Jung and Heidegger. And so, obviously between Jung and Heidegger, the true initiate is Corbin. Even though there is a lot of Jung sometimes that one sees in Corbin, but in a completely refined sort of way, much more refined than Jung himself.
So, just out of curiosity, did Corbin ever encounter Baha'ism?
And he wasn't too impressed with it.
Okay.
His commentaries in several places. I mean, notably in the fourth volume of In Islam Iranien is pretty solid. He dismissed it. He also did the same thing in the History of Islamic Philosophy. He wasn't too particularly impressed with the ideas. Now, it's a shame that he didn't really get to, get a proper introduction to the Bab, because, I had this conversation one time with Todd Lawson. He's the Baha'i academic in Toronto University of, used to be at the University of Toronto. Now he's retired. But he agreed with me that if Corbin, for example, had, read, for example, the Bab's commentary on the Surah of the Cow, and particularly a text like the commentary on the Surah of Joseph, he would have had a complete fana experience, a complete annihilation experience reading a text like that.
Yeah, I would. They seem to line up in ways where it's a shame that he never seems to have gotten there.
No, but I think a lot of that is the times that he was living in. He didn't have any Bayani contacts, it appears. And then you had people like, Sayyid Hossein Nasr, or even, Jalaluddin Ashtiani or Ayatollah Tabatabai, who are, they're Hozavis, they're seminarians. So their own, perspective on the religion of the Bayan is quite biased already. So he would have never, enjoyed a proper introduction to the Bayan. But he was briefly at the University of Tehran, and the University of Tehran hosted a Baha'i scholar by the name of Ali Murad Dawudi, who was an expert on the philosophy of Aristotle. And surely they would have rubbed shoulders. And in these sorts of circles that you're dealing with philosophy, and given the amount of time that Corbin spent in Iran, they would have certainly interacted. And I suspect that Dawudi possibly could have been one of his contacts, and that's why he looked at some of these texts and wasn't too much impressed by any of it. But like I said, had he read, if they had introduced the Bab to him properly, if he had read the actual text, he would have had a complete fana experience reading the Bab.
And that is one of the other things that I consider one of my projects, is bringing the Bab's works to more people in English, because I think that, or at least the context of what is said there, because I think it can really transform both lives and societies to look at things from, in many ways, we seem to be, as a people, on a road to disaster, and taking a time out to look at that road and make the right choice might be helpful. We'll see. I've definitely felt ever since that I started to learn about the primal point. It fit into me already with the mystical pole and the cycle of the kings. The idea to me of the seasons of history that's leading the initiates who seek for it of all ages. It just I find more and more stuff in history that just convinces me that there's a creator, and that the prophetic words that we've been given aren't just to be psychologically Junged away, so to speak.
Which is something that Corbin was very much on page with, even though he was very close to Jung, which is why he talks about a prophetic philosophy. And philosophy in the Platonic sense, not in the way the contemporaries deal with that word. And that is very important. That is very important. But you see, I should mention this, the Bayan and the Bab are very dangerous to certain groups of people out there, and particularly the Baha'is, as you and I know very well, is because the Bab could, if he was accurately portrayed to the world with all of his works translated and analyzed and discussed, he would completely upstage Baha'u'llah, completely. And that's just the Bab. We haven't even talked about Sofa Azali yet. And that is dangerous, because this is a business, it's a corporation. I should mention here that I was approached by a very lovely gentleman, Iranian, who was a journalist for the Independent UK and the Persian section of it. And he did an interview with me about a little under 2 weeks ago, that he wanted to basically, do an article, a piece for the Independent UK on the community of the Bayan. And so he interviewed me. And this piece has been stuck in the editorial for the last couple of days. It was actually supposed to be published on Thursday, but it's gotten stuck in the editorial. And, this is an experience that I have had repeatedly in this domain going on for years. Because if a newspaper, an outlet like the Independent covers this, this is an immediate danger to the Baha'is. And so this is one of the reasons that they have put their own people, they have infiltrated the Anglophone media, especially in the UK, and specifically in the Persian language sections of these places. We're talking about the BBC, the Independent, and, etc. Because, if a story like ours comes out to a wider public, this, in a sense, is game over for these people. And they know that. And so they will prevent, and they will go through any means necessary to silence the voices and ensure that I never get any kind of a wider platform than publishing the stuff online on my own YouTube. So this is what we're facing. But, I mean, I'm not deterred by any of this stuff. I've been facing and experiencing this stuff going on 20 years now with these people. Sooner or later, okay, the proverbial wall of Jericho will collapse. This is as sure as the sun rises each day, and they can try to prevent that inevitable, for as long as they want. But they're not calling the shots. There's a spirit that calls the shots. And, those of us who are on a path such as this are at its behest, not at the behest of these 9 charlatans on the Mount of Doom in occupied Palestine, or their Baha'i internet agency, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm not deterred. Luckily, I have a copy of this interview that was done with me. So if this thing doesn't get published in the next couple of days, I'll actually upload the raw recording that was done on my own page as evidence of this interview. So none of this stuff bothers me, but, these ideas, need more exponents, whether we're talking about Henry Corbin or whether we're talking about the Bab. Because in a sense, the current times that we are living in have this negative eschatological dimension to them. There is, in a sense, amongst a certain cross-section of humanity, who are acting as the counterpowers of darkness, the Baha'is being a central element of this, in my opinion. So, the knights, the chivalrous knights, fighting for this, fighting for the proverbial Orient, fighting for the angel of the earth, fighting for the Imam, is more necessary than ever at this particular time. And it's not an easy path. I am not. People need to get away from the aesthetic of this merely, because a lot of people come, and I've experienced this. People who get drawn to this by the aesthetic of it, right? But then once they come in, they realize how difficult this is and how demanding it is, and what kind of demands they must fulfill to successfully complete a path of this. And so then either they don't do anything or they eventually walk away from it. So, this is not a path for just anyone. This is always a path of a minority, of a Gnostic elect. And that is because of the way that human nature is. Not because, we want to exclude people. It's because, to really be a man, it takes an awful lot of hard yards and being beaten down and getting up again to get there. And an Asiatic path such as this demands it. So either you're up to the task or you're not. But, the aesthetic is good, but the aesthetic is not the only thing that there is to all of this.
I think that's the final word. I don't have much to add to that.
Well, we'll, I think we should do a few more podcasts on Henry Corbin. Have you read his Spiritual Body and Celestial Earth? This was the first thing of his I ever read. If you haven't, I will send you a copy of that. And
I believe I've read it, but it's a while ago, and I've had a new computer since then. So if you send me a copy, I'll be able to.
I will do that.
I'd like to have it in hard copy, and I don't.
Okay. I have my old hard copy here that I bought in 1989.
I have a library of Platonic and Gnostic and anything that I can find related to them. I try to get on hard copy just in case the lights go out. I want all of that stuff on paper.
Well, Corbin should be a central part of that library.
I agree. It's definitely going in. He ties it together. Like, it almost seems like the library that I've built for myself is like a circle around him, and he kind of is the center that ties it together quite perfectly.
Fantastic. All right, let's leave it there then. And until next time.